The silence had become unbearable after 5 days. Every evening at 7:30 sharp, my phone would ring, and I'd hear my mother's voice asking about my day, telling me about hers, sharing little observations about the neighbors or the weather or whatever book she was reading. 37 years old, and I still look forward to those calls like a child waiting for bedtime stories. But Tuesday night, my phone remained silent. Wednesday brought the same eerie quiet. By Thursday, I was checking my phone obsessively, wondering if something was wrong with the network. Friday night, I called her myself, letting the phone ring 20 times before accepting that she wasn't going to answer. Saturday brought panic that settled into my chest like a stone. My mother, Cordelia Anselm, was the most reliable person I'd ever known. She paid her bills on the first of every month, never missed a doctor's appointment, and had called me every single evening since I'd moved out of her house 19 years ago. The only exceptions had been when one of us was traveling, and even then, she'd arrange alternative times to check in. This silence was wrong in every possible way. I called her neighbor, Mrs. Hatfield, a nosy woman in her 70s who kept tabs on everyone on Maple Street. "Oh dear, I haven't seen Cordelia in several days," she told me, her voice tight with concern. "Her car's been in the driveway, and I've seen lights on in the evening, but I haven't seen her in the garden or collecting mail. You know how she usually waves when she sees me." I did know. My mother was unfailingly polite, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and always had time for a conversation over the fence. If Mrs. Hatfield hadn't seen her, something was definitely wrong. The drive from my apartment in downtown Millbrook to my mother's house in the suburbs usually took 25 minutes. That Sunday morning, I made it in 16, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The autumn air was crisp, leaves scattered across the quiet residential streets in brilliant oranges and reds. Under normal circumstances, I would have appreciated the beauty of the season. Today, everything felt ominous. My mother's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a modest 2-story colonial she'd bought when I was in high school after my father's death. The white paint was still fresh from last summer's renovation, the flower beds meticulously maintained even as the season turned toward winter. Her burgundy Honda Civic sat in the driveway exactly where it always did, positioned with mathematical precision between the painted lines my father had marked years before he died. I knocked on the front door first, calling out, "Mom, it's Veronique." The sound of my voice seemed to echo strangely in the quiet neighborhood. No response came from inside. I tried the doorbell, listening to its familiar chime ring through the house. Still nothing. Walking around to the back door, I checked under the ceramic toad where she kept a spare key. My fingers found the familiar metal shape, and I let myself into the kitchen I'd known since adolescence. Everything looked normal. Clean counters, no dirty dishes in the sink, the coffee pot turned off but positioned exactly where it always sat. Too normal, I realized. There wasn't even a coffee mug in the sink, which would be unusual for someone who drank 3 cups every morning without fail. "Mom?" I called out again, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. I walked through the first floor, checking the living room, the small study where she paid bills and read, the half bathroom by the front entrance. Everything was in perfect order, as if she'd tidied up before leaving. But her purse sat on the kitchen counter, her reading glasses folded neatly beside it. Her car keys hung on the small hook by the back door. If she'd gone somewhere, she'd have taken these things. The silence in the house felt different from the comfortable quiet I'd always associated with my mother's home. This was an empty silence, hollow and unsettling. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps seeming unnaturally loud on the hardwood steps. Her bedroom was immaculate, bed made with hospital corners, clothes put away, nothing out of place. The guest bedroom I'd used during college breaks looked untouched. The bathroom revealed no clues either. Standing in the upstairs hallway, I pulled out my phone to call 911. My mother was missing, possibly for days, and I had no idea where she could be. My thumb hovered over the screen when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost dismissed it as imagination. A soft scratching noise, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere above my head. The attic. My mother had converted part of the attic into storage space years ago, accessible through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. I'd been up there countless times as a child and teenager, retrieving Christmas decorations or looking for old photo albums, but I hadn't been up there in years, and my mother rarely mentioned it anymore. The scratching came again, definitely from above. My heart began racing with a mixture of hope and fear. Maybe my mother was up there, hurt or trapped somehow. Maybe she'd fallen and couldn't get down. I reached for the cord that would pull down the attic ladder, my hands shaking with adrenaline. The ladder unfolded with its familiar groaning protest, wooden steps settling into place with small thuds. The scratching sound had stopped. "Mom?" I called up into the darkness. "Are you up there?" No response, but something about the quality of the silence had changed. I climbed the first few rungs, reaching up to find the light switch my father had installed decades ago. The single bulb cast harsh shadows across the familiar space, illuminating boxes of holiday decorations, old furniture covered with sheets, and plastic containers labeled in my mother's precise handwriting. But what caught my attention wasn't what I expected to find. It was what I hadn't expected. In the far corner of the attic, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a makeshift living space. A camping cot with rumpled blankets, a small table with books and papers scattered across its surface, a battery-powered lantern, and several gallon jugs of water. Food containers were stacked neatly nearby, granola bars, crackers, canned goods with pull-top lids. The scratching sound started again, and I realized it was coming from a small battery-operated radio sitting on the table. Static mixed with fragments of distant voices, as if someone had been trying to tune into specific stations. Beside the radio lay a notebook filled with my mother's handwriting, though I was too far away to read what she'd written. My legs felt weak as I climbed the rest of the way into the attic, trying to process what I was seeing. My mother had been living up here, hiding in her own attic for days, possibly longer. But why? And where was she now? As I moved closer to investigate the makeshift campsite, I noticed other details that made my stomach clench with worry. The papers scattered on the table weren't random. They appeared to be newspaper clippings, printed articles from the internet, and what looked like official documents. A manila folder lay open, revealing photographs I couldn't quite see from where I stood. The notebook was filled with my mother's careful script, pages and pages of what appeared to be notes or observations. Dates were written in the margins, some recent, others going back weeks or even months. This wasn't a sudden impulse. My mother had been planning this hideout for some time. But planning for what? What could have frightened my reliable, rational mother enough to make her retreat to her own attic like a fugitive? And if she'd been here for days, where was she now? I reached for the notebook, my hands trembling as I opened it to the first page. The words I read there made me sink onto the edge of the cot, my mind reeling with implications I couldn't yet fully grasp. They know where I am. The first entry read, dated 3 weeks ago. I saw the same car parked across the street for the third time this week. Different driver, but I recognize the license plate pattern. I'm not paranoid. I know what I'm seeing. I flipped through more pages, my mother's familiar handwriting, documenting a growing sense of being watched, followed, threatened by people she couldn't identify. The entries became more detailed as I read on, describing phone calls with no one on the other end, mail that had been tampered with, and strangers asking neighbors questions about her routine. Veronique called tonight as usual. Read an entry from a week ago. I almost told her everything, but I can't put her in danger too. Whatever they want from me, I won't let them hurt my daughter. She has her own life, her own happiness. I'll handle this alone. My throat tightened as I realized why she'd stopped calling me. She'd been protecting me from something, sacrificing our nightly conversations to keep me away from whatever threat she perceived. But what threat? My mother was a retired elementary school teacher who lived quietly, kept to herself, and had no enemies I could imagine. I continued reading, looking for clues about what had frightened her so badly. The entries mentioned research she'd been doing, phone calls to people I didn't recognize, and attempts to verify what Harold told me before he died. Harold was my father's name, though he'd been dead for 16 years. What could he have told her that was relevant now? A sound from below made me freeze, the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. Someone was entering the house. My mother or someone else? I held my breath, listening to footsteps moving across the first floor. Heavy footsteps, heavier than my mother's light step. And there were 2 sets of them, maybe 3. Voices drifted up through the house. Men's voices speaking in low tones I couldn't quite make out. They were searching for something, moving through rooms with purpose. I heard drawers opening, papers rustling, furniture being moved. These weren't people who had been invited into the house. Fear shot through me as I realized I was trapped in the attic, while strangers searched my mother's house below. I looked around desperately for another way out, but the pull-down ladder was the only exit. If I tried to leave, they'd hear me for certain. If I stayed hidden, I might learn what they were looking for, and possibly what had happened to my mother. The footsteps moved toward the staircase. They were coming to the second floor. I quickly gathered the most important-looking papers from my mother's table, stuffing them into my jacket pocket along with the notebook. If they found the attic, at least I'd have evidence of what my mother had been investigating. Check all the rooms again, one of the men said, his voice clear enough for me to hear now that he was directly below me. She has to have left something. 16 years is a long time, but Harold was careful. He wouldn't have destroyed everything. Harold, my father. They were looking for something my father had left behind, something my mother had apparently discovered or been investigating. But my father had been an insurance salesman, a quiet man who played golf on weekends and read mystery novels in his spare time. What could he possibly have had that people would still be searching for 16 years after his death? The daughter was here. Another voice said, "Car's still warm, and there's a coffee cup in the sink that wasn't here yesterday." My blood ran cold. They'd been watching the house, waiting for me to leave. But I hadn't left. I was still here, hidden in the attic, while they searched for evidence of something I didn't understand. "Boss wants us to find her," the first voice continued. "The mother and the daughter. They both need to be brought in before this gets any bigger." Brought in for what? My mother was missing, possibly in hiding, and now these men were looking for both of us. I had to get out of the house and find help, but I was trapped with nowhere to go. The sound of the pull-down ladder being tested made my heart stop. One of them had noticed the attic access. I pressed myself against the far wall, behind a stack of boxes, hoping the shadows would hide me if they climbed up to investigate. Light footsteps on the ladder rungs meant someone was coming up. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small as possible. A flashlight beam swept across the attic space, pausing when it reached my mother's makeshift campsite. "She was definitely here," the man called down to his partners. "Recent food, still some warmth in the blankets, but she's cleared out most of her important stuff." The flashlight beam continued its search, coming closer and closer to my hiding spot. I closed my eyes and pressed myself harder against the wall, every muscle in my body tense with the effort of staying perfectly still. The beam stopped just short of where I crouched, and after what felt like an eternity, the man climbed back down the ladder. "Nothing else up there," he reported, but she was definitely using it as a hideout. Smart woman. Their voices moved away from the hallway as they continued searching other parts of the house. I remained frozen in place, afraid to move until I was certain they were gone. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who were these men? What did they want with my mother and me? And what had my father been involved in that could still be relevant 16 years after his death? The notebook in my pocket felt heavy with secrets I was only beginning to understand. My mother had been investigating something dangerous enough to make her go into hiding, something connected to my father's past. And now I was apparently part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. I waited in the attic for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, listening for any sign that the men had returned. When I finally heard their vehicles start and drive away, I counted to 100 before climbing down from my hiding place. The house showed obvious signs of their search. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered, furniture moved away from walls. They'd been thorough, but not destructive, as if they were looking for something specific rather than trying to intimidate. Professional, systematic, and absolutely terrifying. I needed to find my mother, but I had no idea where to start looking. The notebook might contain clues, but I couldn't risk staying in the house any longer. These men might return, and next time, I might not be so lucky. As I headed toward the back door, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. "Veronique." The voice was my mother's, but she sounded scared and exhausted in a way I'd never heard before. "Mom, where are you? I've been so worried, and there were men in your house, and—" "Listen to me carefully," she interrupted, her voice urgent. "Don't go home. Don't go to work. Don't go anywhere they might expect to find you. Meet me at the place where your father proposed to me. Do you remember where that is?" I did remember. She'd told me the story dozens of times. How my father had taken her to a small park overlooking the lake where they had shared their first picnic and where he'd nervously asked her to marry him 25 years before I was born. "I remember," I said. "Come alone and make sure you're not followed. We have a lot to talk about and not much time to do it." The line went dead, leaving me standing in my mother's ransacked kitchen with more questions than answers. But at least she was alive, and at least I would finally learn what was happening to our quiet, ordinary lives. The drive to Lakewood Park took 45 minutes, during which I checked my rearview mirror obsessively for any sign that I was being followed. Every car behind me seemed suspicious, every turn they made potentially significant. I'd never felt paranoid before, but then I'd never found my mother hiding in an attic or been searched for by mysterious men who knew my father's name. The park was nearly empty on a Sunday afternoon in late October, most families having moved their outdoor activities indoors as the weather grew cooler. I found my mother sitting on a bench overlooking the lake, wearing a heavy jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over her eyes. She looked older than I remembered, her face drawn with stress and exhaustion. "Mom," I said, sitting beside her and resisting the urge to hug her immediately. She looked fragile in a way that scared me. "I'm sorry," she said without looking at me. "I'm sorry for disappearing, for not calling, for getting you involved in this. I tried so hard to keep you away from it." "Away from what?" "I found your hideout in the attic, and I read some of your notebook. Men came to the house looking for both of us. They mentioned Dad, said he was careful, but wouldn't have destroyed everything. What did Dad have that they want?" My mother was quiet for a long moment, watching the lake water lap against the shore. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father wasn't just an insurance salesman, Veronique. That was his cover, his day job, the life he built to protect us. But before you were born, before he met me, he worked for people who did things that weren't entirely legal. He was an accountant for them, keeping track of money and transactions that couldn't go through normal banking channels." I stared at her, trying to process this revelation about the man I'd known as my quiet, law-abiding father. What kind of people? "The kind who don't forget when someone leaves their employment with sensitive information," she said. "Harold thought he'd covered his tracks when he quit, thought they'd leave him alone if he just disappeared into a normal life. And for the most part, they did. He was careful, never kept records at home, never talked about his past, but he also never forgot that someday they might come looking." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the October air. And now they have? 3 weeks ago, I got a phone call from a man who said he'd known your father. He claimed Harold had kept copies of certain financial records as insurance, and that he needed to recover them now that other people from their organization had been arrested. He was polite at first, almost friendly, but when I told him I didn't know anything about Harold's business records, his tone changed. I remembered the notebook entries about being watched and followed. "So you went into hiding." I tried to research who these people were, what they might want. I found newspaper articles about arrests and investigations, stories about money laundering and tax evasion cases that mentioned some of the names the man had given me. Harold's name wasn't in any of the articles, but dates and locations matched things he'd told me about his past. My mother reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal key. "He did keep something, Veronique. Not records exactly, but something he said I should only use if people from his old life ever came looking. I never understood what he meant until now. What is it? A safety deposit box he opened under a false name in a bank in the next county. He gave me this key and made me memorize the name and box number, but he never told me what was inside. He said it was insurance, something to protect us if his past ever caught up with us. I took the key from her hand, its weight seeming disproportionate to its size. Do you think that's what they're looking for? I think your father was smarter than they gave him credit for, she said. And I think whatever is in that box is dangerous enough that they're willing to search for it 16 years after his death. The implications of what she was telling me settled over me like a heavy blanket. My father had been involved with criminals, had kept evidence that could apparently still threaten people who were free and powerful enough to send men to search our houses. My mother had been living in an attic, hiding from people who wanted to find her badly enough to put our house under surveillance. What do we do now? I asked. We find out what your father left us, she said, standing up from the bench, and then we decide how to protect ourselves with it. As we walked back toward our cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The park felt too quiet, the few people we passed too interested in avoiding eye contact. My mother's paranoia was becoming my own, and I understood why she'd been hiding. There's something else, she said as we reached the parking area. The man who called me mentioned that they'd tried to find you first before approaching me. They know where you work, where you live. They've been planning this for some time. My apartment suddenly felt like a trap instead of a home. My job, my routine, my entire normal life had been mapped and studied by people who saw me as a means to an end. I was no longer just Veronique Anselm, marketing coordinator, with a quiet life and a close relationship with her mother. I was Harold Anselm's daughter, inheritor of secrets I'd never known existed. We need to be careful, my mother continued. These people aren't just looking for information, they're looking for insurance that Harold never had a chance to use against them. If they find it, they'll use it. If we find it first. She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood the implication. Whatever my father had left in that safety deposit box could be our protection or our destruction, depending on how we chose to use it. The bank was closed on Sunday, which meant we had to wait until morning to discover what secrets my father had hidden away. 24 hours to stay ahead of people who had more resources and experience than we did. 24 hours to figure out how to survive a game we'd never known we were playing. My mother and I agreed to spend the night in a motel on the outskirts of town, paying cash and using false names. As I lay on the uncomfortable mattress, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound in the hallway, I realized that my quiet, predictable life had ended the moment I'd climbed into that attic. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever my father had hidden away for 16 years, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The daughter who had called her mother every night at 7:30 was gone, replaced by someone who checked locks twice and jumped at every unexpected sound. But I also knew that I would do whatever it took to protect my mother and myself. Harold Anselm's secrets were about to see daylight, and the people who had spent 16 years looking for them were about to discover that his daughter was more resourceful than they had anticipated. The key felt warm, in my palm as I finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of attics and safety deposit boxes and the father I'd never really known at all. Morning came with gray skies and the kind of drizzle that makes everything look dismal. My mother and I met for breakfast at a diner 20 miles from both our homes, speaking in whispers over coffee and untouched plates of eggs. Neither of us had slept well, and it showed in the dark circles under our eyes and the way we both jumped when the waitress dropped a fork. "The bank opens at 9, my mother said, checking her watch for the third time in 10 minutes. It was only 7:15. I'd spent most of the night reading through her notebook, trying to piece together the timeline of events that had led us to this moment. The entries painted a picture of growing paranoia that now seemed completely justified. Phone calls where no one spoke, but the line stayed open for minutes at a time. The same vehicles appearing in her neighborhood repeatedly. Neighbors mentioning that people had been asking questions about her daily routine. "Mom," I said, setting down my coffee cup, "in your notebook, you wrote about research you were doing. What exactly did you find?" She glanced around the diner, making sure no one was listening before leaning closer to me. "I found newspaper archives from when your father would have been working for these people. There was a federal investigation in the early 1990s that resulted in several arrests. Money laundering, tax evasion, conspiracy charges, big names, people who had businesses and political connections. Was Dad mentioned? Not by name, but the timeline matches what he told me about when he left that life behind, and the man who called me mentioned some of the same names that appeared in those articles." I thought about the implications of what she was suggesting. If my father had kept evidence from a federal investigation that had put powerful people in prison, that evidence might still be valuable to someone looking to overturn convictions or settle old scores. "The arrests," I said slowly, "when did they happen exactly?" My mother pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. 1992 through 1994, multiple defendants, trials that lasted years. Some of them were convicted, some weren't. But here's the interesting part. Several of the convictions were overturned on appeal due to problems with evidence chain of custody. What kind of problems? The kind that suggests someone might have had access to original documentation that proved the evidence had been tampered with, she said. "Your father was very good with details, Veronique. If he kept records, they would be complete and accurate." The picture was becoming clearer, though it terrified me. My father had kept documentation that could prove evidence tampering in federal cases involving organized crime figures. No wonder people were still looking for it 16 years later. That kind of information could destroy careers, overturn convictions, or send new people to prison. "We could turn whatever it is over to the FBI, I suggested. My mother shook her head. "And trust that there aren't people in law enforcement who are also looking for it? Your father didn't trust anyone in authority, Veronique. He always said the people he worked for had connections everywhere." At 8:45, we drove to the Millfield Community Bank, a small institution that looked more like a house than a financial center. My mother had called ahead to confirm they had safety deposit box services, speaking to them as Mrs. Chen, the false name my father had apparently used when opening the account. The bank manager, a friendly woman in her 50s named Patricia Voss, greeted us with the kind of professional warmth that suggested she was used to people accessing safety deposit boxes for emotional reasons. Mrs. Chen, I'm so sorry for your loss, she said, apparently referring to documentation my mother had provided, claiming to be the widow of the account holder. My mother handed over the key and the identification papers she'd brought. I wondered how my father had managed to create such convincing false documentation, then remembered that he'd worked for people who specialized in making illegal things look legitimate. Box number 417, Patricia confirmed, leading us through a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Mr. Chen was always very punctual with his payments, never any problems with the account. The safety deposit box room was smaller than I'd expected, with rows of small metal doors lining the walls. Patricia used her master key along with my mother's key to open box 417, sliding out a metal container about the size of a shoebox. Take all the time you need, Patricia said, leading us to a small private room with a table and 2 chairs. Just ring the bell when you're finished. My mother and I stared at the metal box for a full minute before she finally lifted the lid. Inside were several manila envelopes, a small recording device that looked vintage even for the 1990s, and a letter with my mother's name written on it in my father's familiar handwriting. She opened the letter first, her hands shaking as she unfolded pages covered with my father's precise script. As she read, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, understanding, and finally, a kind of grim determination. "What does it say?" I whispered. She handed me the letter without speaking. My father's words reached across 16 years to explain the choice he'd made and the burden he was leaving behind. The first paragraph made my blood run cold with its implications, and I realized that everything we thought we knew about our family's safety was about to change forever. "My dearest Cordelia," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the past has finally caught up with us, and I am no longer here to protect you and Veronique. I have spent 16 years hoping this day would never come, but I always knew it was possible. The people I worked for before I met you are not the kind who forget, and they are certainly not the kind who forgive." I continued reading, my father's words painting a picture of a man who had lived in fear for my entire life, who had chosen love and family over safety, knowing that choice might eventually destroy everything he held dear. I was not just an accountant for them, Cordelia. I was their memory, their insurance policy, the man who knew where every dollar came from and where it went. When I decided to leave that life behind, I made copies of everything, not to use against them, but to ensure they would never have reason to come after my family. As long as those records existed, revealing them would hurt me as much as it would hurt them. It was mutually assured destruction, and for 16 years, it worked. My mother's face was pale as she read over my shoulder. "But now you have these records," she whispered, "and they know Harold is dead, so the threat to him is meaningless." I turned to the next page, where my father's handwriting became more urgent. The letters pressed deeper into the paper, as if he'd been gripping his pen too tightly. "The recording device contains conversations I made during my last months with the organization, names, dates, amounts, and most importantly, evidence of law enforcement officials who were taking money to look the other way or actively participate in evidence tampering. The manila envelopes contain photocopies of bank records, ledgers, and correspondence that prove a network of corruption reaching into federal agencies, local police departments, and the court system. My stomach dropped as the full scope of what my father had been carrying became clear. This wasn't just evidence against criminals, it was evidence against the people who were supposed to stop criminals. No wonder they were still looking for it 16 years later. If you are reading this letter, you have two choices. My father continued, you can destroy everything and hope they believe you when you tell them it no longer exists. Or you can use what I have given you to protect yourselves and ensure that the truth finally sees daylight. I pray you will never have to make this choice, but if you do, remember that silence protects them, not you. The final paragraph was addressed directly to me, though my father had written it years before I was born, to my daughter, who I hope will never read these words. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more capable than I ever was of doing what is right instead of what is safe. Your mother and I have given you a life without secrets, without fear, without the weight of other people's crimes. If that life is threatened, know that you have the power to reclaim it. The truth is your weapon now. Use it wisely. My hands were shaking as I set down the letter and looked at the manila envelopes. The weight of 16 years of secrets sat on the table between my mother and me, demanding a decision neither of us was prepared to make. We could still destroy it all. My mother said quietly, tell them we found nothing, hope they believe us, and leave us alone. I thought about the men who had searched our house, their professional efficiency, their casual mention of bringing us in. They hadn't seemed like people who would simply take our word and walk away. Do you think they would believe us? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. No, she finally admitted. I think they would assume we were lying, and they would keep looking until they found what they wanted, or until they decided we were too dangerous to leave alive. The casual way she mentioned death made me realize how much my mother had changed in the weeks since this had started. The woman who had called me every night at 7:30, who worried about my drive home in bad weather, who saved newspaper clippings about my work achievements, had become someone who could calmly discuss murder as a logical possibility. I opened the first manila envelope, spreading its contents across the small table. Bank statements, handwritten ledgers, photocopied checks, and business correspondence created a paper trail that spanned years. Even without understanding all the details, I could see the pattern: money flowing between legitimate businesses and offshore accounts, payments to individuals listed only by initials or code names, and meticulous records of who had received what and when. The second envelope contained what appeared to be personnel files for law enforcement officials, names I recognized from newspaper headlines over the years, along with detailed records of payments they had received and services they had provided in return, federal agents who had arranged for evidence to disappear, prosecutors who had deliberately mishandled cases, judges who had issued rulings that favored certain defendants. The recording device was an older model, the kind that used tiny cassette tapes. My father had labeled each tape with dates and initials, creating an audio archive of conversations that had probably been recorded without the other participants' knowledge. This is enough to destroy dozens of careers, I said, overwhelmed by the scope of what my father had documented. Maybe hundreds. No wonder they want it back. My mother picked up one of the bank statements, studying the numbers with the careful attention she'd once given to her elementary school lesson plans. Your father was protecting us the only way he knew how, she said. But he was also ensuring that if something happened to him, there would be consequences for the people responsible. I thought about the life my parents had built together, the quiet suburban existence that had hidden such enormous secrets. My father going to work every day, selling insurance policies and attending company picnics, while carrying the knowledge that he possessed evidence that could topple governments and destroy lives. "What would you do," I asked my mother, "if it were just you making this decision?" She set down the bank statement and looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had a week ago. "I would do whatever it took to protect my daughter," she said simply, "even if that meant protecting criminals or destroying evidence, even if it meant letting injustice continue. You are more important to me than abstract concepts of right and wrong." Her answer surprised me with its honesty. I had always thought of my mother as inherently moral, someone who would choose what was right regardless of personal cost. But apparently, motherhood had changed her priorities in ways I was only beginning to understand. "And what would Dad want us to do?" I pressed. "Your father would want us to be safe," she said, "but he also believed that some truths are too important to bury. That's why he kept all of this, instead of destroying it when he had the chance." I looked at the evidence scattered across the table, years of corruption documented in careful detail, proof of crimes that had gone unpunished and victims who had never received justice. My father had carried this burden alone for 16 years, never telling my mother the full scope of what he'd been involved in, never sharing the weight of what he knew. Now that burden was mine, and I had to decide whether to bury it forever or risk everything to bring it into the light. My phone rang, startling both of us. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the timing made me answer it anyway. "Miss Anselm," a man's voice said, polite but somehow threatening. "I believe you and your mother have something that belongs to my employers." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to me. "I think you do, and I think you're smart enough to understand that this situation can be resolved easily, or it can become very complicated. The choice is yours." I looked at my mother, who was listening to every word with growing alarm. "What do you want?" "A meeting. Tonight, you bring what Harold left behind, and we can put this unpleasant business to rest permanently." The word permanently carried implications I didn't want to consider. "And if I refuse?" "Then tomorrow will be a very difficult day for both you and your mother. We know where you are, Miss Anselm. We've known since you arrived at the bank this morning. Patricia Voss has been very helpful in keeping us informed about the Chen account." My blood ran cold as I realized we'd been walking into a trap from the moment we'd entered the bank. Patricia's friendly demeanor and professional courtesy had been an act designed to keep us calm while she reported our every move to people who wanted us dead. "Where do you want to meet?" I asked, knowing I had no choice but to play along for now. "Lakewood Park, the same bench where you met your mother yesterday. 10 o'clock tonight. Come alone and bring everything." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone while my mother waited for an explanation I wasn't sure how to give. "They've been watching us the whole time," I said. "The bank manager, the meeting yesterday, probably even this conversation. They know everything we've done since this started." My mother's face went white with fear. "Then we have no choice. We have to give them what they want." I thought about my father's letter. his belief that silence protected them rather than us. If we handed over the evidence, we would be completely at their mercy. They would have no reason to let us live, and every reason to ensure we could never reveal what we knew. No, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice, we're not giving them anything. Veronique, they'll kill us. They'll kill us anyway, I pointed out. The moment we hand over that evidence, we become witnesses who can identify them. We become loose ends that need to be tied up. My mother stared at me, probably seeing something in my expression that reminded her of my father. Then what do we do? I looked at the evidence spread across the table, thinking about the federal agents whose names appeared in my father's files, the prosecutors who had been paid to lose cases, the judges who had sold their decisions to the highest bidders. But I also thought about the agents and prosecutors and judges who weren't in those files, the ones who had been doing their jobs honestly while their colleagues profited from corruption. We make copies of everything, I said, and then we give those copies to every news organization, every honest federal agent, and every oversight committee we can find. We flood the system with so much evidence that they can't possibly silence all of it. My mother looked skeptical. And how do we know which agents are honest? I pulled out my phone and started searching for news articles about recent federal investigations into corruption. We don't, I admitted, but we don't have to know. We just have to make enough noise that someone honest will hear it. For the next 3 hours, we worked frantically to photograph every document, digitize every recording, and create multiple copies of everything my father had left behind. I uploaded files to cloud storage accounts, emailed copies to journalists whose names I found online, and sent packages to federal oversight offices whose addresses I looked up on government websites. By the time we were finished, my father's evidence existed in dozens of locations, making it impossible for anyone to suppress completely. Even if they killed us, the truth would survive. Now what? My mother asked as we sealed the original documents back in their manila envelopes. Now we go to that meeting, I said, but not to give them what they want, to tell them what we've already done. The drive to Lakewood Park felt like driving to our own execution. My mother sat silently in the passenger seat, clutching the manila envelopes containing the original documents. We had agreed that if things went badly, she would run while I tried to buy her time to escape. The park was dark and empty when we arrived, street lamps casting weak pools of light across the walking paths. I could see figures waiting by the bench where my mother and I had met the day before, though I couldn't tell how many people were there or whether they were armed. Last chance to change your mind, my mother said quietly. Too late for that, I replied, though my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own voice. We walked slowly toward the bench, my mother carrying the envelopes and me carrying my phone with a recording app activated. If we were going to die, I wanted there to be evidence of who killed us and why. 3 men waited for us, the same ones who had searched my mother's house, plus an older man in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of authority that comes from years of making decisions that other people die for. Miss Anselm, the older man said pleasantly, as if we were meeting for coffee instead of extortion. Mrs. Anselm, thank you for coming. I trust you have what we discussed. My mother held up the manila envelopes. Everything Harold left behind, she said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. Excellent. Now, Before we conclude our business, I want to make sure we understand each other clearly. What Harold collected was stolen property that belongs to my organization. By returning it, you are simply correcting a 16-year-old theft. There will be no further contact between us, no ongoing obligations, no need for concern about your safety. It was a reasonable-sounding lie, delivered with the confidence of someone who had probably used similar words to convince other victims to cooperate before he killed them. "There's something you should know," I said, stepping forward. "Before we came here tonight, we made copies of everything, complete copies, digitized and distributed to multiple locations." The older man's pleasant expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "That would be very unfortunate for you, Miss Anselm, and completely unnecessary. We've sent copies to 17 different news organizations, 6 federal agencies, and 4 congressional oversight committees," I continued, watching his face for any sign of concern. "If anything happens to us, if we disappear or die in accidents or suddenly decide to leave town, those copies will be released simultaneously." Now his expression did change, the mask of pleasantness slipping to reveal something much colder underneath. "You have no idea what you're playing with, young lady. The people whose names are in those files have resources you can't imagine. They can make you disappear in ways that leave no trace, no evidence, no questions." "Maybe," I agreed, "but they can't make the copies disappear, and they can't kill every journalist, every federal agent, and every member of Congress who would receive those copies if something happens to us." The older man looked at his companions, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, he turned back to us with what might have been the first genuine expression I'd seen from him, grudging respect mixed with irritation. "You realize, of course, that this makes you more dangerous to us alive than dead," he said. "Dead martyrs create headlines. Living people who can be discredited or disappeared quietly create much less fuss." "We've thought about that too," my mother said, speaking for the first time since we'd revealed our insurance policy, "which is why copies of everything will be released automatically if we don't check in with our contact every 72 hours. Kill us, and you guarantee that everything becomes public immediately." It was a bluff. We had no such automated system, but it was delivered with enough conviction that I saw doubt creep into the older man's eyes. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "We want to be left alone," I said, "completely alone. No surveillance, no threats, no contact of any kind. We'll keep quiet about what we know, but only as long as we feel safe. And if you don't feel safe, then every news organization in the country gets an exclusive story about federal corruption, organized crime, and a cover-up that's lasted 30 years. The older man was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that were all bad for him. Finally, he nodded to one of his companions, who stepped forward and took the manila envelopes from my mother. "This conversation never happened," he said. "These documents never existed, and if any copies of them ever surface, we'll know exactly who to blame." "Understood," I said, though we both knew the threat was meaningless now that we'd revealed the extent of our preparations. As the men walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the park's streetlights, my mother and I stood by the bench where my father had proposed marriage 30 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. This place where my family had begun was now where we had fought to survive. "Do you think they'll leave us alone?" my mother asked. I thought about the older man's eyes, the calculation I'd seen there as he weighed the cost of killing us against the cost of letting us live. For now, I said, as long as we're more valuable alive than dead. We drove home in silence, both of us processing what we'd just survived and what it meant for our future. The quiet life my parents had built together was gone forever, replaced by a new reality where we would always be looking over our shoulders, always aware that our safety depended on maintaining a balance of terror. But we were alive, and we were together, and we had survived something that could have destroyed us completely. Over the following weeks, news stories began appearing about federal investigations into corruption cases dating back to the 1990s. No names were mentioned that I recognized from my father's files, but the timing suggested that someone was taking our evidence seriously. Whether anything would come of it remained to be seen, but at least the truth was finally seeing daylight. My mother moved in with me temporarily, neither of us comfortable being alone while we adjusted to our new reality. We still called each other every night at 7:30, maintaining the ritual that had anchored our relationship for so many years. But now, our conversations included discussions of security systems, travel routes, and the subtle signs that might indicate we were being watched again. The house on Maple Street was sold within a month, my mother deciding she could never feel safe there again. We used the money to buy a smaller place in a different state, somewhere with no connection to our past or our family history. A place where we could be anonymous for a while, at least until we figured out how to build a new kind of normal. I quit my job and started working freelance, giving me the flexibility to change locations and schedules unpredictably. My mother took up painting, something she'd always wanted to try, but never had time for when she was teaching. We were building new lives from the foundation of shared survival, discovering that the experience of facing death together had changed our relationship in unexpected ways. We were closer now, but also more honest about our fears and limitations. The pretense that we were just a normal family living quiet, safe lives was gone, replaced by the acknowledgement that safety was something we would have to fight for every day. 6 months after that night in Lakewood Park, I received a phone call from a federal prosecutor who said she was investigating cases related to evidence my office had received anonymously. She wanted to meet to verify the authenticity of certain documents and recordings. She assured me that my identity would be protected, that I would be treated as a confidential source rather than a potential defendant. I agreed to the meeting, bringing my mother with me for support and security. The prosecutor, a serious woman in her 40s named Rebecca Hartwell, treated us with the kind of respectful caution usually reserved for dangerous witnesses. What your father documented represents one of the most extensive corruption networks we've ever uncovered, she told us, spreading photographs and charts across the conference table in her office. We've already made 14 arrests based on this evidence, with more coming. Some of the people involved are still in positions of power, which is why your safety remains a concern. The arrests had been reported in the news, but I hadn't connected them to my father's evidence until she explained the connections. Federal agents, local police officials, 2 judges, and several defense attorneys had been charged with various forms of corruption. The cases were being handled by a special task force designed to prevent interference from compromised officials. We can offer you protection, Rebecca continued, new identities, relocation assistance, the full witness protection program. But we understand if you prefer to maintain your independence. My mother and I looked at each other, the same thought passing between us. We had already created our own version of witness protection, our own way of staying safe while maintaining control over our lives. The government's protection would mean giving up that control, trusting people we didn't know to keep us safe from other people we didn't know. We'll stay independent, I said, but we want to be kept informed about the progress of the cases, and we want to know if any new threats emerge. Rebecca nodded, apparently having expected this response. Fair enough, but remember that our offer stands permanently. If you ever feel unsafe, if you ever need resources we can provide, contact us immediately. As we left the federal building, walking into bright afternoon sunlight that felt like a benediction, after the sterile fluorescence of the conference room, my mother surprised me by laughing. "What's funny?" I asked. "I was just thinking about your father," she said. "How proud he would be of what we did. How amazed he would be that his quiet wife and daughter turned into people who could face down criminals and federal prosecutors in the same week." I thought about the letter my father had left, his belief that I was stronger and braver than I knew. He had been right, though I'd needed my mother's strength to discover my own. We had protected each other, and in doing so, we had become versions of ourselves we'd never known existed. "Do you think we'll ever feel completely safe again?" I asked as we walked to our car. My mother considered the question seriously. "I don't think complete safety exists for anyone," she said finally. "I think what we have is something more valuable. The knowledge that we can protect ourselves and each other when we need to, that we can make hard choices and live with the consequences, that we're stronger together than we ever were apart." The drive home took us through neighborhoods where normal families lived normal lives, where the biggest concerns were mortgage payments and school grades and whether to vacation at the beach or the mountains. I envied them their innocence, but I didn't regret losing mine. The price of our safety had been our illusions, but what we'd gained in return was a deeper understanding of what family really meant. That evening, as we sat in our new living room in our new city, my mother called me at exactly 7:30. It was silly since we were sitting 3 feet apart, but the ritual mattered now more than ever. It was our promise to each other that no matter what happened, no matter what dangers we faced or what truths we uncovered, we would always stay connected. "How was your day?" she asked, smiling as she held the phone to her ear. "Interesting," I replied, holding my own phone and matching her smile. "How was yours?" "Full of surprises, but then they all are now." We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things, the book she was reading, the freelance project I was working on, the weather forecast for the weekend. Normal conversation in an abnormal life, maintaining the illusion of routine while acknowledging that nothing would ever be routine again. When we hung up, we sat together in comfortable silence, two women who had discovered that they were capable of more courage than they'd ever imagined. The house around us was small and temporary, but it was ours. The life we were building was uncertain and sometimes frightening, but it was honest. Outside, the world continued its complicated dance of secrets and revelations, crimes and punishments. Ordinary people living extraordinary lives without knowing it. But inside our small sanctuary, my mother and I had found something that had always been there, but had taken a crisis to fully appreciate: the unbreakable bond between two people who had chosen to protect each other no matter what the cost. The phone calls would continue every night at 7:30, our anchor in a world that had revealed itself to be far less stable than we'd believed. And every night we would remind each other that we were safe, we were together, and we were strong enough to face whatever tomorrow might bring. My father's secrets had nearly destroyed us, but they had also saved us, not just from the people who wanted to silence us, but from the illusion that love and safety were the same thing. Real love, we had learned, sometimes meant choosing danger over security, truth over comfort, action over acceptance. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I thought about the strange noise that had brought me to my mother's attic just 2 weeks earlier. That scratching sound had been the beginning of everything, the end of our old life and the birth of something new and unknown and ultimately more real than what we'd lost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to prove that we were indeed stronger than we knew. But tonight, we were safe, we were together, and we were exactly who we needed to be.